day, everyone, and welcome to the panel Breakaway session 10. We'll be discussing gearing for growth, how industrialization and global value chains can assist us in Africa. Now, we know Africa has got a rich beneficiation of raw materials, but how do we actually use this resource to help industrialize Africa, considering that we only produce 1.9% of the world's manufacturing goods? We know our China imports a lot of our raw materials and then sends it back to us as finished goods at a much higher price. So how do we address these kind of things apart from the other large manufacturers around the world who are importing our raw materials and creating finished goods that are then re-exported back to us? So the topic of discussion today is, based on the challenges we are experiencing in the global environment, which is mainly localization, the pandemic disrupting global supply chains. How does this actually impact Africa, and how can Africa take advantage of the current disruptions? So we have an esteemed panel here this morning, and we will just take you through this discussion and try and keep it to an hour, where we can talk through some of the key points regarding this. So initially, I just want to talk to Phyllis with her background regarding this. Phyllis, what are your thoughts on what is the critical infrastructure deficits that we have in African countries at the moment, and that how would addressing that help us support industrialization and transform our economies in Africa to more medium-income economies?
Thanks a lot, Vinesh, for the question, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I think you shaped the context quite well. We're seeing a lot of emerging trends in the world, and those are affecting even how Africa continues to position itself within the global value chains. There's the issues of technology, international trade and investment, and also what has been happening with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine crisis. And I think at the heart of this for Africa is the opportunity. The fact that we are at an opportune place to be able to reshape, first of all, the direction of supply chains globally. Due to the Ukraine crisis, for example, in a country like Kenya, we've had shortages of certain raw materials and products. And that issue of looking at how we look at our value chains and all that is something that is becoming very, very critical. So for Africa, I think at the moment, a big priority is to integrate into the global value chains. And as you mentioned, we're at a very low level of integration, with a lot of our products being primary products and only 1.9% of manufacturing happening within the continent. So for that reason, there's need, even as we integrate, for us to promote value-added manufacturing and also invest in more high-skilled tasks and technology. This is a very complex conversation because it's not just about having the infrastructure, but seeing, first of all, how we then build a strong manufacturing base and really look at economic transformation as a basis and with infrastructure as an enabler. So for me, I look at it at 4 levels. The first thing, first of all, for us to participate fully in global value chains is the need to integrate, which is really what the AFCFTA is about. It's about regional industrial policy, integration, seeing how we reduce the trade barriers within the African continent, deal with issues of market access. So at the heart of it, that's, I think, very critical. And in integration, one of the other key things is the reliability and efficiency of logistics and trade facilitation. And that's where infrastructure can come in at the level of integration. How do we build strong logistics chains? And that's the road network within Africa, our port infrastructure within Africa, both land and air. The rail infrastructure, and I believe rail is one of the affordable ways, if done efficiently, to connect countries across Africa. So I think integrate for me is one of the areas we can look at. The other one is about competing. Being able to put in place policies that address the market failures and distortions within Africa. That way you're able to facilitate your farms to grow. So you're creating a competitive business environment that becomes a springboard. Then the next area for me is upgrading, looking at how we upgrade then our skills, our technology, our industries, our farms, look for the high growth potential farms and grow them through the value chain. And the last one I will talk about enabling, and probably this is where a lot of the infrastructure comes in, to be able to build a comparative advantage within Africa and upgrade the value chains. Infrastructure will be at the heart of it. So that cuts across our energy infrastructure. In Africa, we have low access in many parts, high cost of energy. So looking at the issues of cost, accessibility, reliability, quality of energy. So energy infrastructure is a key one. The issue of transport infrastructure, I spoke about the road network, the rail network, how we create that interconnectivity within Africa. There's the issue, of course, also of communication infrastructure and systems. Because of the world we are in, we are moving into more e-commerce, technology, digital technologies, and all that requires very strong communication infrastructure. So the other things like water, housing, sanitation, those are social infrastructure, but also that are required within the continent to be able to see the social and economic growth. So Vinesh, broadly, that is the path, I think, as we set a basis for this conversation. Thank you.
Now, Phyllis, thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Yes, I think you've touched most of the important points, and I like your structuring into 4 main areas. Maybe Corey can give us a point of view on the infrastructure side of things with his background.
Thank you, Vinesh. I want to take a bit of a step back, and when I prepared for this, I had a look at what does economic effectiveness actually, how it's measured, and I just want to comment on 4 of the categories that I found. The first one is obviously economic performance, and I think although we're not one of the strongest in the world, I think we might be the strongest in what we call pockets of excellence. I think across Africa, it's something we really need to focus on. I think we just look at our sport in the last month as a pocket of excellence. I mean, to have people that have won the most Commonwealth medals as well as what we did. It says a lot about us. And I think sometimes we need to refocus from the big picture saying that we're not good to what are we actually good at and what we can gear on. The second one is government performance, because I see that as the foundation, as the enabler, and creating an environment for us in the private sector. I come from a very pragmatic, practical point of view because I sit in electrical engineering. We do bulk infrastructure for housing and we're part of the renewables. So for me, it's policies that come forward, what government create. And I know there's a huge drive for action at the moment. The third one is business efficiency. I think, again, it's nearly like the Gini coefficient in South Africa. I think there are absolute leading businesses in the world in South Africa, but there are the majority of businesses that we throw money at and try and make entrepreneurs. Now, I really see the businesses as the players and the taxpayers. And then the last one, infrastructure creation. And if you travel the world, South Africa definitely doesn't have the worst infrastructure. I just think it might not be very well maintained for a period and upgraded. But if you look at our roads, I mean, travel abroad to Europe, and there's nothing wrong with the main roads in the country. Coming back to my own environment and your question about, so how do we address things? I think if those are attended to in terms of the macro picture, if you go to the micro picture where I sit in electrical engineering, and let me speak mainly about housing and renewables, I think our housing program, which I've been part of the last 20 years, actually produced quite a lot of housing, and the infrastructure around that is super good. I mean, only over the last few years we've seen the load shedding that impacts heavily. I mean, we fell, I think, at the peak of South Africa's generation was around about 50 gigawatt. Sometimes we're down to 2023, but it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means, as I said, it's not maintained. Our major challenge, and if I don't answer your question, just give it to me again, is infrastructure integration. It goes back to exactly to what Phyllis was saying. And it's actually on both sides, housing and on the renewables. In housing, it's, and I wanted to have make my opening statement as charity starts at home. We are still in silos when it comes to housing. When there's electrical infrastructure, there's no civil. When there's civil and electrical, there's no water. I think it's just generally, and that's why I started with the opening, someone at a higher level needs to coordinate how do we deliver. But we still deliver. We still have mega projects that work well and does well as well. Available bulk is shrinking at quite a rate. And if I say available bulk, it means new bulk as well as existing bulk, in the sense of we actually have a bottleneck in providing people with housing, as we have a limited supply. But as you heard with the president over the last few months, it's mainly on the generation side, the distribution networks, and a lot of that's in place. So for me, our main challenge participating globally is home integration and really make sure we are leading in what we are doing. And maybe we should be looking at, as I say, our pockets of excellence. Just quickly jumping to the renewable infrastructure. I think, again, there's the charity, what we don't see is alignment from who can generate and where we can tie into the grid. I've seen a report 2 weeks ago of what's available in terms of what we can tie in. And I don't want to be very specific at the figures, but let's take the Northern Cape that most probably got 60, 70 gigawatt to offer, but only a 5-6 gigawatt uptake with the current networks. Because there's one thing of transporting power from the power stations down, but it's uncoordinated. It's like a water system. You cannot build a massive input at a household level. You need to look at the bulk infrastructure. So my general thing about competing globally is we need to get our house in order, break down the silos, support each other. But I don't think we're short of the pockets of excellence and excellent examples of how we can build on what we have to become an entity in the world environment. I trust I answered what you were referring to.
Yes, no, thank you so much, Corey. So what you and Phyllis said, yes, you're talking about a lot of stuff that requires government intervention, right? And we know we don't have the most efficient governments across Africa with due respect to African governments. So how do we address this without obviously relying on government only? What is within our control to try and address these? So if you look at railroad, that's all directly in government's ambit. But how do we manage this? What solutions can we propose to influence the way forward? Because obviously policies affect all of us, but then how do we influence policy? What is more effective? We've been trying to influence policy, or when we have good policies, the implementation thereof is not very good. Or if we sometimes have complete policy uncertainty where governments contradict each other, different departments contradict each other. So how do we address this? What potential solutions do we have for the problems that we're mentioning now to unlock this challenge? And that's open to the entire floor here, team.
I think in 2 seconds, Vinesh, I think that's why I called the whole government performance the platform for us to be able to springboard off. And I hope governments get more and more awareness of the potential of the African countries if it's just opened up in the sense of coordination from a government point of view to create a playing field. South Africa is still, and I'm talking South Africa because I sit in South Africa, most probably one of the most difficult places to do business. I mean, I know there's an index on how difficult it is to do business, and maybe government must just have a look at that index and say, can we not improve that? Just make it easy for people to do business. The rest, we are super inventive in Africa. Logistic problems and those we get around, we quickly have a look. I think somewhere there must be an awareness from a government point of view that they actually the platform for us to play from.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a case here to be made for. I mean, we speak about the government responsibilities, and there certainly is a lot of work that the governments need to do in order to get the politics out of the way of a harmonized a policy environment. So for instance, if we have an industrial policy that actually speaks appropriately to the resources that are available to us, the markets that are available to us, that speaks to the opportunities of the day. But I actually do also think, having worked a lot on policy issues for business, both in organized business and consulting for big corporates across Africa, I think there is a recognition that business needs to make that Africa simply doesn't have the soft market infrastructures that a lot of more developed markets have in place, where government and business actually speak to one another. We tend to, and of course that's very much a South African experience, we tend to have very adversarial relationships in many instances. South Africa, of course, that's exacerbated by the social corporatist system, NEDLAC and the like that we run here, where business, government and the social constituencies and labor tend to be in their own different corner, and you get a lot of proxy politics playing out. There's not a sufficient number of cooperative platforms where business and government can come together to together figure out policy solutions. And it is necessary to establish that kind of cooperation, because the different stakeholders in government, the same with stakeholders in business, everybody tends to have a self-reinforcing effect in their little corner where they sit. So if you're on business, you don't always understand the challenges of policy making. You understand the challenges of investment and creating a return on that investment, whether you run a stakeholder or investor maximization business model. Government doesn't always understand that, the same with labor and so on. And the idea is really to facilitate a system where you can have the pocket of excellence that Corey referred to earlier be replicated easier, instead of waiting for trickle-down systems where government is supposed to take a particular action, or there's elite agreements that take place between business and government, and then it almost makes it impossible for smaller or new entrants to come in. So that is just the first thing that I wanted to mention. So then I think Phyllis and Corey did an excellent job of explaining very comprehensively what some of the challenges are and opportunities. I think from a broader perspective, I think Africa would do well to focus a little bit more on aligning with global imperatives and trends. So the first thing that I would like to mention is really the sustainability imperative. Very important, because there's a huge urbanization movement that is happening in Africa at the moment. Into cities that are not built for the kind of environmental and sustainability challenges that we are facing. We've had recent experience of that on the East Coast in South Africa. There's significant problems every rain seasons in cities across Africa and East Africa, where we don't have the infrastructure to cope with these intensifying environmental dynamics that we are seeing, as well as various other challenges around water supply and so on, where the infrastructure is just simply insufficient to cope for what is happening. At the same time, business models have changed significantly. In the economy that we were 80 or 100 years ago, centralized energy generation might have made sense. It doesn't make sense to run an energy utility on a 1920s business model in 2020 or 2022, where we're currently at. And we shouldn't really try and keep on bumping our head against that same a wall if we want to effect change. So therefore, I was quite surprised, for instance, when we recently saw the proposal about an ESCOM 2.0 in South Africa. It was just something that was completely incongruent with the lessons of the day. It's just we can only hope it's a dog whistle to a constituency rather than a serious proposal. Then, in line with the whole issue around sustainability imperatives and changing business models, there are actually quite a bit of work that has been done around how companies can reevaluate their business models against new sustainability pursuits, such as introducing greater circularity into the economy and various other issues that they might look into. And that actually can kick up new business opportunities. The second sort of broad trend that I would just like to mention is the whole trend of changing models of value creation and retention. Partly as a result of technology, which is the third bit that I want to get to. But it's the whole, I suppose, not just Uberization, but also Amazonization of businesses. And what this means is further along the trend of a greater decentralization, is that everything does not simply have to be manufactured and sold in one place. You don't have to manufacture and export to be part of global value chains. The global value chain also includes intellectual property information that can certainly be leveraged. And I think part of that also includes the repair economy, which is very important and could be a very effective driver of value creation and manufacturing activity. Also because if you improve the repair economy, if you get greater access to technology in our economies, that will obviously drive innovation as well. And then the very last thing that I wanted to mention is around technology. A couple of years ago, this isn't the first time that we had major supply chain interruptions in the last couple of years. I remember, for instance, a couple of years ago, there were quite a number of significant weather events, including the tsunami in Japan, where there were significant disruptions to supply chains, subsequent to which there was a very definite trend. I mean, onshoring didn't only start with Donald Trump. It started before that, when technology started to make it possible to have smaller scale manufacturing done in a more decentralized way. And it also happened because of these extreme weather events, where people started to realize you can't keep or diversify your supply chain and make it possible to cover your risks when there's interruptions.
Thank you, Conrad. Yeah, we're going to touch on that in our next piece of this conversation, but I'm just going to go back to Phyllis regarding policy and what the view is from her part of the world.
Thanks for the question. Nice listening to both Corey and Conrad and the good views. Where I sit from the work I've done at Kenya Association of Manufacturers, which I was in for the last 9 years, and it's basically an advocacy organization that works closely with government, but I've also had the opportunity at the same time to sit on government boards, so I can look at it from both sides. So one of the things is that the reality is that there are certain public goods that only government can deliver. And that's a reality, like huge infrastructural projects and some of the social required things like water, roads, and other things. So that must be done by government. However, government does have coordination failures. If you look across many of our African countries, there are a lot of coordination failures, whether it's within the government departments themselves or within institutions that cut across board. On the other hand, private sector has a good understanding of market failures. That's why if you speak to private sector, there's a lot of feedback on the experience within the market, which government sometimes does not understand because they don't actively participate in the market. And private sector is also very heavily invested because they've put in their capital and resources within the country. So I look at it from two angles, that without effective public-private dialogue and cooperation, we will not make the milestones and build the excellence that we have within the continent. So one of the roles, of course, of private sector is not just to point out the market failures, but also look at our own farm level efficiency, productivity, and competitiveness, so that you're addressing as much as possible the waste, bringing down cost of production at farm level. So that's one thing that we did a lot with Kaizen and supporting industries to relook at their own processes internally, to build the skill sets within the factories and to build that farm level efficiency. But on the other hand, government can benefit from input and the thinking of private sector to help reduce the coordination failures within government, to help also build up efficiencies and problem solve together with government. So some of the experiences we've had, like during COVID, there was a very strong public-private partnership in addressing COVID, in coming to the table, in thinking through how we build up the industries that would support during that period, and also deal with issues around logistics and everything around that. So I think public-private dialogue is really at the heart of addressing these coordination failures, building up efficiency. At the Tony Blair Institute, where I moved to now, I'll be driving the public-private dialogue within the African countries where we work. Also for the Tony Blair Institute, the model we take is to support governments on delivery and working at the center of government, which is mainly with the presidency. And we look at it at 4 levels. The first thing is to work on strategy with the governments to identify either sectors or areas that require strategic input and support, because you have to make choices as a government. Governance is about making choices. You can't do everything. So we work with them to help make the right choices from a strategy perspective based on their own priorities. Then we work on the policies that need to be improved within those areas. Then we work on delivery, which I think sometimes is the missing link, support with embedded advisors within either the presidency or key government agencies to ensure that you're able to deliver on those strategies. And then at the basis of that is technology, how we can enhance the power of technology or harness the power of technology to build up efficiencies within government. And now we want to strengthen the public-private dialogue so that we have those opportunities for learning and feedback loops between the public and private sector to consistently improve on this going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. And now I want to ask Daniel for his view on the local policy for manufacturing. How can manufacturing grow on the African continent? And what policy interventions do you require regarding this, based on what Phyllis just mentioned now? You unmute.
Thanks, Vinesh. And it's very good to be here today. And great to hear all of the very valuable input from the other panelists. So, I mean, in terms of my experience and the world that I come from, I come more from the investment and the finance world. We play a lot in the manufacturing sector as well as many other sectors. And when we look at some of the issues that are experienced by SMEs in Africa, in South Africa, especially where we specialize, it's incredibly difficult for businesses, especially manufacturing businesses, to actually run their businesses. And especially when it comes to exporting and playing in the global sort of supply chain. If you look at some of the issues that, and I think Corey touched on this a bit earlier, how the ease of doing business index in South Africa is extremely low. It is very difficult for businesses, especially manufacturing businesses, to operate. I think there is a lot of room for improvement, and I think where something that underlies all of this, of course, infrastructure is critical. And we've spoken a bit about the other panelists have spoken about some of the key needs when it comes to technology and other aspects of infrastructure, logistics, etc. Investment is critical across all of these. And when we talk about investment, we can be talking about anything from grant funding to equity funding to debt funding, the plethora of different types of debt funding. And of course, there's blended and hybrid instruments that can be used in financing these projects. And I think that sort of underlying layer of finance is critical for SMEs to actually operate and deliver on these projects and play in that global supply chain. So when it comes to local policy and contributing to manufacturers, actually playing in that global supply chain, I think improving ease of business is absolutely critical. I think friendlier policy, especially for manufacturing, but not limited to manufacturing, is critical, and having overriding policies that apply to SMEs is also important. So not necessarily sector specific, but we've seen a lot of progress around the world with SME specific acts or bills coming into play. And Nigeria 2 weeks ago just announced their startup bill, which is about to become law, and these sorts of things are critical to make it easier to actually do business and play in those global supply chains and to do so on a competitive level. So I think when it comes to ease of doing business, simpler compliance, better tax laws for these businesses, and of course having the necessary investment to actually deliver on those projects. I think all of that is critical.
Thank you for that, Daniel. From your point of view, right, these are not new challenges, right? What potential solutions can there be? How do we get the ear of government across Africa to listen to us? Because we have been beating this drum for many, many years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, some of the other panelists already touched a bit on this, and that is, I think, one of the most important things is better partnerships between the private sector and government. We saw this during COVID, where, right at the beginning of COVID in South Africa, our government had a brilliant plan to introduce a 200 billion rand COVID loan guarantee to support SMEs throughout the pandemic. And unfortunately, less than 10% of that funding actually was deployed and ended up in the hands of SMEs. It was a great idea, but unfortunately, the execution fell apart. And I think the part of the reason for that was the limited partnership that government played with the private sector. So they did partner with traditional banks, but it wasn't a very deep sort of partnership. It was more of a government saying, this is what we'll do. We'll give you this guarantee, and you must now go and provide finance to all the SMEs in the country. But there was a lack of clarity there, and a lot of concerns around, whether what were the rules and regulations around those guarantees, how easy would it be to actually claim on them, etc. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the private sector, and that's part of the reason why those funds weren't deployed. I think there are other aspects and other complications in terms of government not having partnered with other players that might have been better suited to help deploy those funds efficiently and on a great scale. So apologies if I've rambled on a bit there, but deeper private-public partnerships are absolutely critical when it comes to solving some of these problems.
If you look at the industrialization of other comparative countries compared to those in Africa, take at some African countries got left colonization in the 60s, and look at South Korea post the Korean War and how they developed and industrialized their country via a number of 5-year plans. Then there was a definite step by government to do things in an incremental way. What's your views on that, Lesetja, if on the South Korean success story, about how would that apply, if it does indeed apply, to Africa in our current level of manufacturing capabilities?
Thanks, Vinesh. It doesn't quite apply purely because of the scale of the African continent. It makes it very difficult to draw like-on-like comparisons for that particular reason. The second is the African continent is not homogeneous. So we actually have what is a asymmetrical market, and the way that it functions is also typically decentralized. All that is happening now is that we're finding ways to use technology to be able to accelerate the delivery using a decentralized mechanism. A classic case in point would be if you look at the public sector transport systems in South Africa, specifically the minibus taxis. It has strangely enough been able to prove that it has a commercial reason to exist on the African continent, despite the different regimes that come into power and despite the different economic and socio challenges that we face on a regular basis. It says something about the dynamism of the entrepreneurs, of course, but it also shows that we understand how fluid a market it is that we live in. I think giving credence to what Corey and Conrad had said earlier, it is important for us to remember that on the African continent, in order for things to be able to achieve a level of performance that's consonant to any of the other international markets, we need to look at a few things. The first has to do with how we share our professional body knowledge. In this regard, specifically look at project management expertise. We have many centers of excellence. We have many competent people, but unfortunately the level of demand is such that a lot of the projects happen simultaneously, and then there's a shortage of this requirement across the continent. But if we were to share that capability and that expertise very broadly, call it a directory of project management experts or engineers, you'd find that we wouldn't have the lagging projects that we have. The Grand Inga River, for one, comes to mind. The second area that I think needs looking into is how we deal with intellectual property. Remember, intellectual property is fundamental, especially where you look at the upkeep of infrastructure. In my view, we tend to depend way too much on intellectual property that is not homegrown, which then also bloats the budget in terms of being able to run and maintain the infrastructure that we have in place, whether that's telco systems, ICT systems, or it's sensors that we'll eventually need to have for, say, autonomous driving on roads, including having multimodal hubs where you can have maritime, rail, air, as well as road infrastructure that seamlessly works together. We've struggled to be able to do so. And I think fundamentally the reason has to do with IP. If we were to ask a fundamental question to all the governments on the continent and say, can you give us a register of all the intellectual property and all the studies that you have funded on a master's or PhD level, including the independent studies that have been done, you'd find that we're very hard pressed to very efficiently be able to give a pulse of exactly what that is. So we tend to duplicate effort and we tend to miss opportunities and extend the length of projects beyond what is actually necessary to be able to make these things work. There's also something to be said about indigenous knowledge systems, linking that into intellectual property. There's a lot of know-how that is embedded in the regions, but for the sake of many different dialects, as well as cultural norms, that information has not surfaced in formal ways where it can be peer-reviewed and be adopted more formally on a global level. If Africa is going to ascend and be able to supersede being an emerging market, I think that is going to be a very important ingredient so that we can bring something to the table that doesn't already exist in the global sphere. And that will allow others to be able to see us as peers rather than as potential users of products only. I think that'll be a fundamental shift in terms of how things work. Two other areas ring true. The first has to do with how we apply our balance sheet norms. So there is an international accounting standard that we should be using that links back into indigenous knowledge systems as well as intellectual property. And what we find is if we adopt those things, we can have a stronger balance sheet to be able to request the type of financing that is required. In the absence of strong balance sheet, it is a futile exercise to knock on the international investor market and try to that is just not something that is going to happen. With the institutions, the developmental finance institutions that we have on the African continent, it stands to reason that if we were looking at things such as this IP reflecting as part of our balance sheet as a norm, we would be able to strengthen our position significantly so. My recommendation would be that we should be asking ourselves the question, how would the United Nations, through their technology initiatives, support how we expedite the process of being able to standardize that best practice? We cannot do things the same way as they've been done in the West. One, they've already been done. Two, we will not have a competitive advantage. And three, in order for us to be able to keep generating more value, you need that level of novelty and innovation to be a non-negotiable. And we have that in bucket loads. Unfortunately, our formative system really lets us down in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you, Lesetja. Yeah, so I just want to pick up on that point. I know we're running a bit out of time here to get through all our little discussion points, but the IP point is very, very interesting in that we have lots of IP, but the question is, our IP then gets monetized in other parts of the world. And in my point of view is why? And normally the clear answer is not having sufficient venture capitalists who are prepared to take a risk in African-backed technology ventures. So, Daniel, do you have a view on this coming from your investment world? Why does there appear to be a threat of not insufficient investment bankers prepared to become even like maybe angel investors in some of these in businesses?
I think that that has largely been the case for the last few decades, or for all of time, for that matter. It does. The sense that we get in the market is that the tides do seem to be changing very slowly, and I think we've still got a long way to go. It might be accelerated by the collapse of the VC and private equity space in Western markets mostly, and where investors are now seeking better returns than what they're seeing in those markets where it's completely collapsing. And so what we've seen in the last year to 2 years are significant amounts of venture capital investments coming into Africa, certainly a lot larger or higher than previously seen. I think where, something that is critical for any investor investing into Africa is having the necessary regulations to support and protect their investments. Things like in South Africa, like exchange control, can make it very difficult investing into businesses in South Africa or into IP or intellectual property into South Africa. And of course, currency risk is something that always complicates any sort of international cross-border investments, and the hedging costs that might come along with that. So I think we've still got a long way to go. It does seem like the tides are changing, and I am excited to see that international venture capital investment into Africa continue. But it also would be amazing to see local investors and more venture capital actually being deployed locally. So there are many venture capital firms throughout Africa, but what from our personal experience and also from what we see in the market with many of our SME clients is that the local venture capitalists do not have the same risk appetite that you might see with VCs overseas. And so it is incredibly difficult as a small business, as an SME, to actually raise and access that capital. So there might be a lot of capital going around, a lot of funds being raised, but actual SMEs or startups, businesses accessing that capital, being able to meet all the super strict criteria, unfortunately, we still got a long way to go locally in Africa.
Yeah, Daniel, I think you made a good point there, if I may. So the question of risk is fundamentally also linked into the question of, because you're asking, do you have enough data to be able to business case in your environment? Now, the challenge with African continent is that you don't have a high quality data set that allows you to be able to negotiate that position successfully. Now, it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because if you're going to run a data census, then you're going to be waiting for a really, really long time. However, if we can come to terms with an approach that allows us to have perhaps subsector specific focus, potentially even building out of, call them the national key points, because most of the national key points are a great significant indicator of the excellence that we have, as well as the infrastructure and expertise and investment. So my question would then be, is it possible to be able to do extensive data mining using the national key points within each country and then regionally and then across the continent to be able to say, if you do things in this particular way, you can then have a data set that is respectable on a global level to be able to drive this level of investment that's required. My sense is if you exclude such an intervention, it's not likely that we're going to see the winds of change that we so greatly desire, not only on the continent, but the global economy also desires the inputs of Africa for their novelty, for their hardiness. So we're not only depriving ourselves, but the global market, and to be able to find new ways of bolstering it.
Great point, Sacha. Conrad, can I ask you about now with the disruptions in the global supply chains, right? What opportunities does that bring to us in Africa? How do we leverage those? And what infrastructure do we require to help us take advantage of those opportunities?
Well, I think I want to latch on a little bit about to the intellectual property discussion. I'm actually currently engaged in a project across African Union, Ocean Developing Island states, looking at well, it first looked at intellectual property barriers to the emergence of the circular economy, and then latterly looking at the kind of contribution that right to repair can make in that respect. And part of the lessons of that journey has been certainly in comparison to what's happening on the continent, not necessarily so much so for those smaller states, is that we often tend to wait for government. We often tend to depend on high-level agreements between business and government to follow an inductive approach to making these kind of things happen, instead of looking at what kind of transversal regulatory interventions can be made and other interventions that can be made to enable a more bottom-up, a more deductive approach. And so a simple thing like right to repair could be incredibly effective there. You know, the repair economies have, in the developing world, the repair economies have a potential to contribute to between 1.5 and 3% of GDP in general. So this is independent repairers. This is people working in their backyards that start tinkering with stuff, that start fixing it, that start in that way getting exposures through technology. In that way, they start to learn how to use that technology better, to repair, to refurbish, and to even create their own products. But it's often hampered by restrictive intellectual property rules. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for weakening intellectual property. That's the other point that I wanted to make, is that if we want people to invest in the creation of intellectual property that needs to become the ownership of Africans or in African states, we certainly need to also look at strengthening our intellectual property regimes, but it doesn't mean that right to repair cannot be pursued. And it's something in the context of global supply chain constraints that could be incredibly effective, because obviously if you make parts, products and their parts, if you extend their lifespans, you make them more durable, then obviously you solve two problems, the one being the sustainability issue, and the other being not being so dependent on international supply of parts and components. In terms of the infrastructure side, I sort of more or less want to make the same point. I'm perhaps unique in this discussion, and having had experience across government, politics, organized business, and corporate consulting. And I certainly do not ascribe to the view that there's certain things that only government can do, even something like water. If we speak about another area where infrastructure has huge potential in South Africa is the development of smart cities. Now, of course, the mistake that we make is to want to go and recreate the wheel somewhere else instead of upgrading what we've already have and trying to overcome our spatial legacies and so on. But there, for instance, the politicians are not the ones, the policymakers are not necessarily the people that have the expertise on what intelligent infrastructure can do for something like water supply, for instance. So this is where you need to have that engagement between government and business become better. But if we say, there's a tendency to always say, business and government, we need to have deeper cooperation, we need to be better. We need to stop saying we need to cooperate more. There's already a lot of cooperation. Yes, there's always more that can be done, but the quality of it needs to change. It actually needs to work back from objectives rather than being theaters for proxy politics or talk shops. And in that sense, I think you will start to see a greater action on both the infrastructure front and liberalizing the space for innovation and localization of the economy. I don't think it always needs to be it needs to be something that shoots the lights out. It doesn't always need to be the highest tech, the shiniest object. Something as simple as just liberalizing repair in your local economy can already make huge strides happen in your small business sector, in the formalization of businesses and delivering tax to government.
Thank you, Conrad. That's something I didn't think about previously. Phyllis, your view on the opportunities specifically presented to us because of the global supply chain disruptions?
Thanks for that. And just to weigh in on what Conrad has said, the place of public-private partnerships, even in delivery of public goods. So I agree that that is an area that we can enhance. And the improvement of the quality of dialogue, because you're right that a lot of this eventually end up being talk shops. So unless we're very clear what the outcomes of this dialogue is, how we structure it, and how we monitor the outcomes, it can end up actually being something that becomes very ineffective for both public and private sector. So on the global supply chain disruptions, we do see opportunities for the continent to take advantage of, because in a sector that is a strategic, let's say as textile and apparel, we are seeing a lot more companies looking to source from Africa. And that gives us an opportunity in the textile and apparel sector to build backward integration all the way from cotton to fashion and take advantage of the global markets that exist and also the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So, for example, in AGOA, the extension of AGOA, I think, is being considered currently because it's coming to an end in 2025. But one of the big opportunities is to see how we can shift some of the supply chains in the textile and apparel sector to the African continent. In West Africa, for example, there's very high quality cotton, but not much development of the end-to-end apparel sector. So there's currently work we are doing through the Tony Blair Institute to support countries in West Africa, including Togo and Cote d'Ivoire, to look at their textile and apparel sector and how we can get more investment in that sector, because that way you're starting to build end-to-end and then linking it with other parts of Africa, where, for example, the cotton and the spinning could be done in parts of Africa, and then where there's expertise and experience in apparel sector and really integrating with a global supply chain, there can be an interchange and learning between the two. So those are some of the examples I could speak to about the opportunity just in that sector. That's one sector, but across all sectors, there's a big opportunity to drive up more investment in Africa, look at strategic sectors where countries have an advantage, and that's really what we're trying to do, to really look at, in a country, what are some of the strategic sectors for the countries to go into, what are the business cases that would make sense for investors in those countries, and then working on investment attraction to see how we bring on board investors into these countries. Thanks.
A fantastic point, Phyllis. Yeah, in South Africa, we've seen that exactly play out here, where one of the very large fashion retailers is now localizing their entire production. They're going to build 10 new production plants in South Africa. And the objective is twofold. Obviously, supply chain disruption is one thing, but faster response to the market, because fashion is obviously quite fickle and you change your lines quite quickly, and you can't wait for things to be shipped across the world if you want to change what's on your shop floor quite quickly. So very, very real example that we appreciate that. Thoughts from you, Corey, on how infrastructure can support Africa growth now? I haven't heard from you in a while.
Unmute. Yeah, no, it's super interesting, and I mean, I really enjoy the input. That's why I'm quite quiet, and it comes from a lot of different angles. I think before I go to that question, I just want to bounce a little bit. I think where we lose as Africans, the fact that we're so diverse. I'm looking at one of the big medical schemes in South Africa. How it started off as a small thing, and I mean, I listened to a speech of the CEO where he said, in South Africa and Africa, because of our diversity, there's actually a lot of novel ideas that actually floats into the world we never take credit for, because the system doesn't support it. I mean, just going up, I mean, the other day someone was in London, and he said he sat in a franchise that's South African. There was a stationary vehicle that drove past that South African. The scheme on the sport was supported by a South African company. And because of our, can I say, lack of coordination sometimes between all of us, again, it goes to the public-private working together. We are massive creators of something we never get credit for. And it goes exactly the same to infrastructure. And I think if we can just work a little bit on the world trusting us, that we do with the money that we promise them we're going to do, we will be a leading entity in a lot of things. I think sometimes we miscue it between government and the private sector. And I totally agree with what Koenraad was also saying, that, you know, I think the private sector can deliver most probably everything government can deliver, but it's not always their place. And that's where I see government and the future of Africa is public-private partnerships, where we take it per project and we support. If government introduces or executes infrastructure, it must get support from the private sector. If we do it as the private sector, government need to support us. And if that happens and we can just collab better, infrastructure will be better planned and built. Because it goes back to my earlier point where we lose the thing a little bit, is the fact that when there's less coordination from government, people do not stop delivering, but they just deliver for themselves and their communities. And it ends up so fragmented that, I mean, look in South Africa, just drive around in Gauteng and see how many buildings and building projects, but uncoordinated, we as a nation don't benefit from it. The pockets of excellence serve the world, not the nation. So back to your question about infrastructure, I think if it's just better coordinated, and we as the private sector just have better quality, and that came up from someone, forums where we really break the silos down, we plan together, we spend the money together. I don't foresee why we cannot play in the international markets. Go and Google how many South African-born companies are actually in the global markets. And yet, if you look at our performance, it's weak. Why? Because we don't coordinate it and we don't claim it. So yeah, I trust I answered what you said. I took a long turn to get to a point.
No, thank you, Corey. That was very valuable. We're getting near to close of our session, panelists. And yeah, I just want to quickly summarize what I heard. So what we heard today was, we need, for infrastructure being mainly government's domain, we need to really change the thinking of government and get them more involved and get them to accept the ground realities of what is going on and how they can further support us. How we do that is a challenge, and therefore private-public partnerships are going to become more valuable for us to try and make this happen faster, because we know there's obviously ideological challenges with certain government not wanting to privatize certain aspects, etc. But how do you get past that to show it's for the greater good of the people, particular basics like water and electricity? Then with the supply chain disruption, there's a massive opportunity for us in Africa, like the examples you've given us, Phyllis. But really, there's also much more. And with Africa Free Trade Agreement coming into play, we really need to leverage that, how we can ship raw materials across Africa instead of across seas to beneficiate it in Africa and then sell it back to our neighbors. So that's how we become part of the creating our own African value chain. I would rather use that term. So with those are my thoughts about my key takeaways from this, apart from what Lesecha said about protecting our IP, right? We really need to monetize the IP locally as well, with the support of the financial bodies, which are completely risk averse at this point in time, in my opinion. Those are my thoughts, and now I'll open up the floor to each one of you to give your closing thoughts, and then we can wrap up the session. I'll now go in reverse order. So, Kunrad, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just say that we mustn't be too fixated with our navels. We must remember the world's moving. There's green taxonomies for investment and things like that that's popping up all over the world. So we really do need to keep our eye on those standards and make sure that because that could be a significant barrier to being plugged into global supply chains. You will find yourself locked out if you don't keep in step with those things. So I think that would just be my final thought that I leave this discussion with.
Yeah, you're quite right. ESG is becoming such a big relevant conversation nowadays. Satya?
Yes, I think what is very important for me is for us to find better ways to be able to use the data that we know on the ground and formalize it, and for the African institutions to collaborate with each other. I'm not talking government on this level. I'm talking business, and I'm talking professional entities that we can share our best practice and be able to work seamlessly on key projects. The reality is, on a continent as big as our own, there isn't a single country or a single company that can rule out the infrastructure that is required. So unless we find a way to supplement each other's know-how, we are always going to find projects that deliver short of what their potential actually is. And we just need to get stuff done together.
Great point. Thank you. Phyllis?
Thank you for the good conversations. My closing parting short would be, even beyond manufacturing, looking at other productive sectors that are tradable beyond borders, because that's another place an opportunity lies for Africa. If we look at things like the opportunity within BPO, telemedicine, and the new digital products that can be delivered as tradable services beyond borders, that's an area we need to look at. And also the fourth industrial revolution, look at how we can take advantage of these technologies and even build some of them within the continent, because currently 90% of the fourth industrial revolution technologies sit within about just 10 countries globally. So there's an opportunity for us to also develop within the continent some of these technologies, digital solutions that can then be utilized to really drive up our productivity and efficiency. Thanks.
Yeah, fantastic point. Yeah, we must really take advantage of the technological benefits. Daniel? You're on mute.
So yeah, I think as we've touched on already in summary from my side, public and private partnerships is critical to establish the necessary infrastructure for Africa to play its role in the global supply chain, as well as to create this African supply chain that we've spoken about. And I think it especially is the case when we talk about investment and ensuring investment readiness into the businesses that are actually driving this across Africa. I think that is absolutely critical, and the sort of deeper partnership between private and public sectors will be a critical enabler to all of that.
No, definitely. If you combine Phyllis's point about the technology, but you've got relatively lower labor costs in Africa, and with the investment, we definitely have a good business case ahead of us. Finally, Corey.
Absolutely.
I want to take a bit of a different angle, and I'll be brief about it. I think we live in times of massive disruption, and disruption is the new norm. And sometimes in business we forget, like COVID. So I just want to finish with 5 disruptors that I think is most probably the ones to keep your eye on. The fourth and the fifth industrial revolutions. It will have massive change, impact, positively and negatively. Negatively if you don't participate, and in underemployment. And go and have a look at what happened since '85 with underemployment to people, overqualified people in low jobs because of technology and industrialization. The next one is overpopulation. That goes with the environment, environmental protection. I think that it's going to be, it also connects to the next one is the world health threats that might tie us down a lot, and it goes with what Kunrad said with international legislation as well. And then the last one is global competitiveness. We live in a world with over 7 billion people that all wants to make a living. If you're not master of your craft and you can't collab and work together effective and efficiently, you're most probably going to miss the cue. And especially of global competitiveness and participating in their value and not supply chain so much. And with my emphasis on value versus just supply. Yeah, but that's so what I'm trying to say is in a disrupted world that became the new norm, use the opportunity of disruptors, but also make sure that you are proving yourself a little bit against it, because having a 5-week lockdown for the private sector and then a lot of lockdowns after that really hurt us big time. But some businesses were born from that, and there's opportunity in every disruption. Thanks. Yeah,
that's a great way to conclude, Corey. Yeah, opportunity in every disruption, and that's what we need to leverage. And as I say, it favors the opportunity favors those that are ready for it. So we must be ready when these opportunities knock on our door. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for making yourself available for this discussion this morning, and really have a good day further. It was a fantastic discussion, and hopefully we can get some good comments and questions from those who are have listened to us today. Thank you very much.